Well, good evening. Can you hear me okay? That's probably better, isn't it? I want to tell you about the discipline known as textual criticism. I'm sure this is your favorite topic, and that's why we have so many people here tonight. But for those of you who don't know, I'm going to illustrate it this way. I want to tell you about a young scribe by the name of Brother Andrew. He was studying at what was the equivalent of a seminary back in about the 9th century in Great Britain. And he was a very devoted student, very detail-minded. When he finished his course of study, he went to a monastery to live out the rest of his life. And the equivalent of the president of the seminary wrote a note to the abbot of the monastery. And as was the custom for many millennia, actually, when someone was going to get a job or work someplace or live someplace, they would bring a letter of recommendation that was in a sealed envelope or sealed in some capacity, and then they'd bring it to the person, and then they'd discover what the recommendation was all about. So Brother Andrew is leaving the seminary with this sealed letter. He goes to see the abbot, and the abbot looks it over, and it says, "This young man is very detail-minded. In fact, he's anal." Is that okay to say here in Ottawa? It's okay in Dallas. Some places, not so. Anyway, not at Southern Baptist churches. But, so he said, "I recommend that he be a permanent scribe, and he copies out your most intricate documents." So the abbot decided, this is good news. We haven't had a scribe work on these manuscripts for a long time. And so he said, "Brother Andrew, I'm going to put you to work on copying out the bylaws of our monastery." So we went into a room and set them up and said, "Now I want you to start copying out these laws." Nobody's copied them in hundreds of years. And so he started working on that. About 45 minutes later, there was a knock on the abbot's door. "Holy Father, there seem to be some discrepancies in these manuscripts. I'm not sure exactly which ones are giving me the better reading." And so the abbot sized him up and said, "Young man, I've never done this before, but even though this is your first day, I'm going to take you to another room where we have even older manuscripts of the bylaws of the monastery." And so he took him to this other room, and about 45 minutes later, there was a knock on the door again. "Holy Father, we have a problem. These manuscripts are not lining up. Have you got anything older?" And he sized up the young man and he said, "Brother Andrew, I've never let anybody do this on the first day or any time. You're going to get to go into the bowels of the library and see the original bylaws of these manuscripts." And so he took him down a labyrinthian path into a subterranean archive room and put him at this dusty old desk. Nobody had been there in centuries. And Brother Andrew started copying out the original bylaws of the monastery so he could make sure he'd have a good, clean, accurate copy. And about 30 minutes later, there were 20 hands pounding on the door of the abbot. He opens the door. "Holy Father," all the rest of the monks were saying, "This new scribe has gone berserk. He's down there in this archives room that we've never seen before, but he's just going nuts." And so they all scurry down, and they go to see him at his desk, and he's pounding his fist, and he's yelling and screaming, and he said, "They left out the letter R. They left out an R." And the abbot says, "Man, this guy is anal." And then Brother Andrew says, "The word is supposed to be celebrate." There's a small patch of people over here that got it first. Then it kind of swept across in the back of the room, got it last. Are you guys from Syracuse? Just checking. Anyway. Well, sometimes individual letters make a big difference, and my field of textual criticism looks at these individual letters as well as larger issues. And so I want to ask the question tonight, how badly did the scribes, the ancient scribes, corrupt the New Testament text? We know that they corrupted the New Testament text because we have no two manuscripts that are exactly alike, and every manuscript of any length has errors in it. So that's an established fact. They have corrupted the text. How badly did they do it, and can we get back to the original wording, are the questions that we're going to be looking at. So I want to start by quoting that great scholar Dan Brown in his book, The Da Vinci Code, where he says, "The Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book." Well, you all have heard this. Many of you have probably said it at Starbucks and other places, at the office and racquetball court and all. You say, hasn't the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times we can't possibly get back to the original? That's the first question we're actually going to answer, but we're going to look at a number of issues. Let me give a different individual who has a little bit better clout to him, academic clout, C.J. Werleman, who is an atheist. His first book was God Hates You, Hate Him Back. Now, he likes to be provocative, and that title to me is rather ironic. If you're an atheist and you say that God hates you, don't you really mean nobody hates you, hate nobody back? But anyway, that's what his first book was. Then he wrote Jesus Lied. And here's what he says. "We do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies." Now, the first few sentences here, he's probably correct. The last sentence, he just made that up. And I'll actually show you the source that he's using. Here's a source that's a little bit better than Dan Brown or an atheist who writes that God hates you. This is M.M. al-Azmi. He's a well-known British Muslim apologist. And his book, The History of the Quranic Text from Revelation to Compilation, a comparative study with the Old and New Testaments, he made the profound statement, and I want you to feel the full weight of this. "The Orthodox Church, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God, but a man; Docetism, the opposite view that he was God and not man; and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, that is, the view that Jesus Christ is one man, he is fully divine and fully human, this sect deliberately corrupted the Scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects." Now, if al-Azmi is correct, then that means that the New Testament originally looked entirely different from how it looks today. That the New Testament originally did not affirm the deity of Christ, but in fact had competing views, conflicting views, contradictory views that the later so-called Orthodox Church sorted out and changed to reflect their own theological vision. Where do these people get these ideas from? Not a one of them that I've quoted is a biblical scholar, not trained at all in Greek or Hebrew, not trained in biblical studies, in church history, in the biblical text, the Old Testament, the New Testament. But this man is, Bart Ehrman. Craig Evans mentioned him a few times tonight already. And Bart is a very well-known New Testament scholar. He is kind of America's darling for the media when it comes to religious issues, especially around Christmas and Easter, when people like to especially talk about Jesus was not born in Bethlehem. He did not die and rise again. That's when we get just some of the wacko views that come out there. But Bart Ehrman is a bona fide New Testament scholar. He went to Moody Bible Institute, an evangelical institute in Chicago, and then went to Wheaton College to get his bachelor's degree. That's another evangelical school. And he started to learn Greek when he was at Wheaton. He was an evangelical, a Christian at the time. Then he went to Princeton Seminary and studied under the great New Testament scholar, Dr. Bruce Metzger, where he earned both his Master's of Divinity and his Doctor of Philosophy degree in the field of textual criticism. Bruce Metzger is sometimes considered to be the finest textual critic of the 20th century, and Bart Ehrman had the privilege of studying under him. In 2005, he published a popular book that was kind of a reduction of what he had done in academic circles 12 years earlier, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And when he published this book, Misquoting Jesus, it made a huge splash. Now, over the years after his doctoral program, Bart started to drift further and further to the left until today, and in 2005, he considered himself to be an agnostic. And when this book came out, it made a huge splash, so much so that within a few weeks, he was on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, and Stewart interviewed him and said, wow, with all these textual variants among the manuscripts, it makes the Bible just feel like it's somehow more godly, kind of a designer spirituality. I guess you can pick and choose what you want to believe. But he said, I congratulate you, sir, that's one hell of a book. That's not normally an adjective we would use to describe a book about Jesus, but nevertheless, that's what Jon Stewart said. So the next day, the book was #1 on Amazon. So I've got to get on The Daily Show. It's really important. Anyway. So one place in the book, Ehrman says, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. This is where Werleman got his idea that we don't have copies for 20 generations, which Ehrman never said. But this is his source. And then later in the book, towards the end, in the conclusion, he says, the more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them. So here he's saying something that Al-Azami is saying, that the Orthodox have corrupted the text of the New Testament. And Ehrman is not somebody to trifle with. He knows his business. I have known him for over 30 years. We're friends, we work on projects together, and we debate each other occasionally. Well, as we begin to wrestle with this issue tonight, there's two attitudes that I think we need to avoid. And the first one is radical skepticism. It's a view that says all views are possible except anything that resembles Christianity, of course. And it's a view that says there's no possibility that we could get back to the original text of the New Testament. Dr. Evans alluded to the difference between Alexander the Great and the New Testament in terms of the kinds of evidence we have. It's a remarkable difference, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit further. Radical skeptics are those who say there's no way we can get back to the earliest texts. Dan Brown and Al-Azami are the kinds of folks that would say that. Then the other view that many of you who are Christians might have is that of absolute certainty. This is also an attitude that we need to avoid. It's an attitude that grows out of modernism. It's an attitude that we get down in Texas every once in a while. Someone says, well, if the King James Bible was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. And so when they bring up that kind of an argument, I decide I need to pitch my conversation at a little bit lower level, and so I say, well, how about them Cowboys? But those of you who are Christians who use a modern translation still may have this sense of absolute certainty. The Bible you have in your hands, you might say, is the very Word of God in every single detail. No, it isn't. It's a translation, and translations make mistakes. And even if you brought to church the original Greek and the original Hebrew, it's based on later manuscripts, and we're not sure exactly which ones go back to the original wording. And consequently, even if you use the most popular Bible ever, the NIV, if you take that to church, the 1984 edition was different from the 2011 edition in a number of places where they changed the text that they were translating for the New Testament. So if before 2011 you said every single word in this is the Word of God, you'd be wrong. And after 2011, I still think you're wrong. We're just not exactly sure in a number of places what the original text has to say. So those are two attitudes that we need to avoid, but what we're going to try to wrestle with is which one should we come closer to tonight. And there's 4 questions that we want to answer. How many textual variants are there? How many differences among the manuscripts do we actually have that we have to count and you'll be surprised at the number. What kinds of textual variations are there? I'm dealing first with the number of variants, then the nature of the variants. That is, are these going to be theologically significant? Do they affect just spelling? Are they somewhere in between? What's the deal with them? And a more specific question along the same lines is, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? What's interesting is kind of the skeptical argument nowadays against the New Testament has moved to a degree from, I don't believe the Bible, to how do you know that's what the Bible actually says? And so it's a preliminary kind of a question. How do you know that's what's in the original New Testament? And so these are some questions that we have to wrestle with, because Muslims and other groups are saying that what you guys claim is the original New Testament was added centuries later. Tomorrow I'll be wrestling with a question about whether Emperor Constantine invented the New Testament canon, the 27 books that go into the New Testament. And some even think he invented the deity of Christ, which we'll address tonight briefly. Then finally, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? So these are some really fundamental issues. If you're a Christian, I think you ought to see that how you answer these questions is going to be extremely significant for your faith. And for those of you who aren't Christians, maybe you've made some assumptions about the Christian faith that are simply dead wrong, and you need to rethink some of these issues. But we'll look at this, and I'll try to be as clear as I possibly can. Now, those 4 questions, I have a history in my lectures of doing a long preface. We're still in the preface. And then taking the first question, and it would take about 45 minutes, and then we got 5 minutes for the other 3. So don't feel nervous about how long we're going to be going tonight. I've been allotted 3 hours, so I'll make sure to stay within that time. Somebody claps. Good, I'll take the time then. All right. By way of preliminary question, no, okay. By way of a preliminary question, don't we have the original New Testament anymore? No, we don't. All the New Testament documents were written on papyrus, which was an ancient type of paper that has kind of the consistency of our grocery bags, not the plastic, the paper, you know. And it was more durable than our modern day paper. But for the most part, papyrus could not last very long if it was in a humid climate. Now, the best places we've found to find ancient papyri is Egypt, because of the dry climate. And in a town known as Oxyrhynchus, there's this town that's above the water table, and so it did not ever get the decay of the humidity of other places. And over 100 years ago, they started excavating this town and other cities in Egypt, and have found well over 1 million scraps of papyrus. And only about 1% of these have ever been published. But what we know about the New Testament is that almost surely it was written on papyrus, and written on papyrus rolls or scrolls. Now, we also know that a form of the book known as the Codex was invented in the second half of the 2nd century, probably towards the latter part of it. The Codex form, for those of you who are under 35, you're not going to recognize this. It's a form of a book that has binding on one side and then cut pages that flip. So you can see this page and flip it, and there's more writing on the backside. If you're under 35, all you've ever seen is a scroll on your computer, which is a really retro way to go. But, so if you're over 35, you're more up to date on technology. Bet you never thought that. So, do we have the original New Testaments? Our best evidence is that they would have turned to dust within about a century after the completion of the New Testament. We do have a church father who doesn't have great reliability on this issue, Tertullian in the late 2nd, perhaps early 3rd century, who mentions that the originals of Paul's letters are still there. But we do have some evidence that they existed well into the 2nd century, maybe about 150, 160, something like that. But all of our New Testament manuscripts, every single one of them is written on a codex. And the original New Testament manuscripts would have been written on a roll or a scroll, precisely because the codex form hadn't been invented till very late in that 1st century. And consequently, if all of our New Testament manuscripts are written on a codex, then by definition, they're not going to be the originals. Why would they have been destroyed? Well, not from somebody coming in and finding them and destroying them, but rather, think about it this way. You have the church at Rome that gets a letter from Paul, and they value this letter to the Romans. And some guy from Corinth comes to visit one day. He said, hey, I heard you guys got a letter from Paul. We got a couple letters from him too. I'm in here for a few days. I've got a secretary, and he'll write it out if you'll let me take a look at it. Oh, yeah, that's no problem. So go ahead and have him copy that out. And it's the word celebrate, not celibate, so that was good for them to know. Sorry, bad joke. Anyway, so that's the kind of copying you'd get. Some non-professional scribes who were just amanuenses or secretaries for businessmen, and they started to distribute the New Testament this way in a totally uncontrolled fashion. There was no school that said, here's how we're going to copy, and here's how we're going to orchestrate what goes into these manuscripts. This kind of evidence right here is the very evidence that shows that Al-Azmi is not telling the truth, that these scribes did not come along and decide, here's exactly how the New Testament is going to read, and we're going to change all the other texts. We have evidence before the great Orthodox Church of the 4th century started to define what they believed about Jesus. We have a number of manuscripts before that date, and they don't seem to have significant differences from the later ones. So, back to the issue. The New Testament manuscripts would have been destroyed within about a century, and what's interesting is there's some work that was done by a fellow named George Houston on how long literary papyri would last in a home, like Plato's Republic and Homer's Iliad and this kind of thing. And what he discovered in some of these ancient libraries that were excavated is that you'd have an average shelf life of maybe 150 to 400 years of a literary text. So it's a text that people would value and want to read. It's not just a scrap of papyrus saying, honey, please get these things at the grocery store today, but it's something that they would want to keep around. So how does the New Testament compare to that? Well, the reason I want to argue that the New Testament manuscripts probably were just fell apart within a century is because they were treated as valuable as literary texts. Very early on, the Christians began to realize how significant these documents were. And even though they did not yet regard them as scripture until we get into the 2nd century, they regarded them as important, and so they would make copies of them. It's precisely because they copied them and copied them and copied them that they would have fallen apart so early on. So we don't have the originals. Well, what about the copies? Can't we just compare all these New Testament manuscripts and figure out what the original said? Yeah, we can, but it's a little bit trickier than just saying, oh, they all agree, so that must be the original, because they don't all agree. You take the two closest related New Testament manuscripts of the first 8 centuries, Papyrus number 75 or P75, and Codex B or Vaticanus. Those two manuscripts disagree between 6 and 10 times per chapter. Multiply that out, that's about 2,000 differences for the New Testament if they both read for the whole New Testament. Those are the two closest for the first 8 centuries. All of our manuscripts disagree with each other. There are no two that say exactly the same thing. So precisely because of the disappearance of the originals and because of the disagreements among the copies, we have to do textual criticism. So, again, one last preliminary, then I'll actually get into my lecture. My time's just about up, though, isn't it? So, okay. Number of variants. I need to define what a textual variant is. It's any place among the manuscripts in which there's variation in wording, including word order, omission, or addition of words, even spelling differences. One letter difference, like celibate, celebrate, those things count as textual variants. Now, I should also point this out. A textual variant is counted not if you have, say, in some manuscripts in John chapter 4, verse 1, they'll say, when Jesus knew something about the Pharisees, versus when the Lord knew. Now, we have maybe 1,000 manuscripts that say when the Lord knew and about 500 that say when Jesus knew. You don't say, okay, I'm looking at the manuscripts that say when Jesus knew, there's 1,000 that differ from that. That's 1,000 variants. No, it's one variant found in 1,000 manuscripts. That's a very important point to make, so that you understand that with the many manuscripts we have for the New Testament, it doesn't matter how many manuscripts attest to a textual variant, a textual difference. It still counts just as one variant. Now, let me give you the number of how many words we have in the Greek New Testament. It's approximately 140,000, or more exactly, 138,162, according to the closest critical text we have. And don't ask me how I know that, but I'm related to Brother Andrew. How many variants do we have? Well, the best guess is about 400,000. That's about 2.5 variants for every word in the New Testament. Or as Bart Ehrman likes to say, there's more variants than there are words in the New Testament, which is really an understatement. It's about 2.5 times as many variants as we have. So I think that's the good news. Let's just go ahead and take questions now. Now I'm going to do, some of you may have heard of this old fart named Paul Harvey. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. That was his show. The reason we have a lot of textual variants is that we have a lot of manuscripts. There was a fella 301 years ago named Richard Bentley who wrote a book called Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking, and a large section of the volume had to do with defending a scholar who had put together for his life's work all the textual variants he could find in all the manuscripts he could gain access to. It was a fellow by the name of John Mill, and it took 30 years of work. It was 2 volumes. He found 30,000 textual variants in just 99 manuscripts. And then he looked at church fathers and ancient translations, and Mill never defended his work. He got criticized by Roman Catholics who said, well, you Protestants have a paper pope, and he's got footnotes. You know, he's got marginal readings. How do we know when he's speaking ex cathedra? Because you've got this Greek New Testament that's the equivalent of your paper pope, and it has differences. How do I know what he's saying? And there were Protestants who criticized John Mill by saying he's doing the work of the devil. Why is this the work of the devil? Well, he's looking at manuscripts and history, and he's stirring things up. Yeah, he's doing good historical research. That's never the work of the devil. But John Mill, curiously, never defended himself. And the reason, even with all these criticisms, is because 2 weeks after he got this book published, he died. And so he has become a great model for me. When I write my magnum opus, I want to die within 2 weeks after it's done, so I don't need to face my critics. But here's what Richard Bentley said about that. If there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, 1516, when the first Greek New Testament was published, then we would have had no various readings at all. And with the text being in better condition then than now that we have 30,000 variant readings. In other words, if you had a single manuscript, it doesn't ever disagree with itself. It's not going to have variants. Does that make us in better shape now than it is now that we have 100 manuscripts and they differ with one another 30,000 times? It's good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. Richard Bentley is universally recognized as a man who is light years ahead of his time, and Bart Ehrman, Bruce Metzger, textual critics of all stripes have found that his writings are absolutely remarkable, and his insights were way ahead of schedule. What New Testament scholars face today is much more than 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts. We have what classical scholars would term an embarrassment of riches, and they have a dearth of evidence. Our Greek manuscripts for the New Testament now number 5,839. And some of those go all the way back to the 2nd century up to the time of the printing press. That 5,839 is the official number as of 2 months ago, by the way. But there's more that will be added to it because of my organization, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which goes around the world to digitally photograph these manuscripts, and every time we photograph some, we find them as well. Now, these are not just scraps of papyrus. Some of them are small. That's quite true. A manuscript can be any size as long as it's an identifiable text. But the average size, this is the average size Greek New Testament manuscript, is 459 pages long. So these are not tiny, and it's the same for the ancient versions. Then we have Latin manuscripts. The New Testament was translated into Latin beginning in perhaps the late 2nd century or early 3rd at the very latest. And we have more than 10,000 copies of the Latin New Testament, handwritten manuscript copies by scribes before the time of the printing press. More than 10,000 of them. And that's because Latin became the lingua franca starting really in the 4th century, sweeping across all of Western Europe, and Greek it shrunk more and more after Constantine moved the empire to Constantinople, today's Istanbul. But then the New Testament was translated into other ancient languages. like Coptic and Syriac very early on, Georgian and Gothic and Old Church Slavonic, Armenian and Arabic and Hebrew. The best guess is we have between 5,000 and 10,000 copies of the New Testament in these languages. That's actually a low estimate, and every time I've debated skeptics, I've put these numbers up, and they've never disputed them. Now, if somebody had a magic wand and could wipe all these manuscripts out in a single fell swoop, and some of you might wish you had that magic wand, we would still not be left without a witness. And that's because of church fathers, scholars of the church, bishops and presbyters and elders and abbots who wrote volumes on the New Testament. Beginning in the late first century, right up until the 13th is typically how they're counted. And these church fathers wrote homilies, sermons, theological treatises, commentaries on the New Testament. And they did not have the gift of brevity. They would comment on a verse, and this becomes extraordinarily valuable for scholars. So you get a church father in, say, the 5th century who's commenting on a verse, and he mentions the verse, quotes the verse, and then he'll comment on it for another page or two, talking about virtually every word in the text. Well, seeing that in the comments tells us that's what the church father's text actually said when he wrote. So we can pinpoint when the text looked a certain way by these church fathers. Well, how many quotations of the New Testament do we have by the church fathers? It's over 1 million. We're not exactly sure how many times the New Testament would be duplicated or multiplied again and again, but by the 1970s, the quotations hit over 1 million. So I don't know what the numbers are up to now, but there's a place in Boiron, Germany that's been tabulating this, and the rest of us are waiting for all the publications that come out from this. So you can see we have an embarrassment of riches for the New Testament. Now let's take a look at the average classical author, the Greco-Roman author, writing in Greek or Latin. And these numbers are inflated. I need to let you know that. These are numbers that are not exact. They are very much on the high side because when I've debated skeptics, I've used these numbers and they recognize that they've got nothing they can argue against. The average classical Greek writer has less than 20 copies of his work still in existence, and most of them have 2 or 3 copies of their work still in existence. We're talking about the better-known writers that typically have as many as 20. Sometimes they get higher than that, sometimes even into the hundreds. But if you were to stack those manuscripts up, it'd be about here, 4 feet high. That's it. How high do you think the New Testament stack would be? Well, let's take a look. Come on, you can make more of these. That's as much as I wanted to do in PowerPoint. Now you take that New Testament stack, you multiply it by 8. And it becomes over 6,600 feet high. It's about 1.25 miles high. 4 feet, and I'm being generous, over 1.25 miles. And I haven't counted the church fathers' quotations at all. I don't know how to tabulate that. That's why we have an embarrassment of riches. Now, let me look at a couple ancient historians and biographers, the kinds of writers who would come closest to what the New Testament is. And you discover that we're waiting hundreds of years before we get single copies of these works, and we don't get very many of them. Pliny the Elder wrote in the 1st century AD, and we're waiting 700 years before we get a single shred of any copy of his writings, although we do have something like 200 copies of it, so that's pretty decent, but we're waiting 700 years. Plutarch, a very important author, we're waiting 800 years before we see a single copy of his writings. Josephus, Dr. Evans mentioned Josephus in his book 18, where he mentions Jesus, and he also mentions James, the brother of the Lord, and John the Baptist. We're waiting 800 years before we get a single copy of any of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. And Antiquities, book 18, was copied by more often than the other books precisely because it mentions Jesus and John the Baptist and James. 800 years before we get a single copy. Polybius, 1,200 years before we get anything. Pausanias, who wrote the geography of Greece, 1,400 years before we see any shred of a copy. Herodotus, one of the two ancient historians of the ancient world who really set the pace for ancient historiography, writing in the 5th century BC, we're waiting 1,500 years before we get anything more than just a small shred of a copy. 1,500 years. And Xenophon, his Hellenica, we're waiting 1,800 years before we get anything that's more than just a scrap of papyrus. Now, let's say the New Testament was like Xenophon, that we were waiting 1,800 years before we got any copies. That would be like saying that the earliest copy of the New Testament that we have was written at about the same time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Do you think skeptics would have a field day then? Yeah, they would. Why don't they with Xenophon then? Why don't they with Herodotus or Pausanias or Polybius? Those writers are not questioned in terms of what they actually said, even though we're waiting hundreds of years, more than a millennium in many, if not most cases, before we get a single scrap of evidence from any of these authors. And yet, that's how it's done with the New Testament. If you were to actually look at the average classical Greek or Roman historian in terms of his manuscript evidence that he has today, and you take the writings about Alexander the Great, Herodotus, and some of these others, and the great historians of Rome, Livy, Suetonius, and Tacitus, we would have approximately 1,000 times more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than we do for these other writers. About 1,000 times more evidence. So, you say, what that really comes down to is if we're going to be skeptical about the New Testament, we need to be about 1,000 times more skeptical about the other ancient writings. In fact, what we need to say is when Greek got reintroduced into the rest of Western Europe by way of the Renaissance and then the Reformation, we might as well throw that period of history out, because those people were mistaken. The Greek that they read was 1,000 years after the originals. And so to get us out of the Dark Ages, it never should have happened because everything they read was based on a lie. Is that true? Of course not. We know about the past from these manuscripts, none of which are original documents. They're all copies. But the New Testament, what about the earliest copies? Do we have any that come within 1,000 years or maybe even 500 years? Yeah, we do. The average classical Greek author, his writings were waiting at least half a millennium before we see any copies at all. At least that much time, 500 years. With the New Testament, we're waiting decades. Let me tell you about the discovery of P-52, which was not a follow-up airplane to the P-51 Mustang in World War II. Those of you who are over 55 know that joke, but anyway. Here's a photograph of it. This was discovered in 1934 at Manchester University in the John Rylands Library by a man named C.H. Roberts. 1934. Let me go back 90 years before this. In 1844, a German scholar by the name of F.C. Bauer, teaching at Tübingen University, published an article in the Tübinger Jahrbuch in which he argued that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160, and it should be dated around 170. Now, he applied great philosophical constructs to come up with this. No historical evidence whatsoever, but philosophy is what he used. And European scholars bought it. For the next 90 years, everybody was late dating John well into the 2nd century, and adding a corollary. Therefore, John can't have anything that's historically reliable, whatever, because it certainly wasn't written by John the Apostle or any first century person. Until 1934, when C.H. Roberts discovered this scrap of papyrus. On one side, it has John 18, verses 1 through 33 on this side. On the back, it has John 18, verses 37 and 38. Immediately, Roberts recognized this as a Christian document, even though before he'd translated it. How did he know it was Christian? Because for the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, the Common Era, 80% of all Christian manuscripts were written on a codex. Only 20% of all non-Christian manuscripts were written on a codex. So he said the probability is that this is a Christian document. And in fact, By AD 500, the rest of the world had caught up, and now they started to use the technology that the Christians, even though they didn't invent it, were the first to popularize this new codex form. It's the only time in the history of the Christian church that we were ahead of the technological curve. But at least it's once. Roberts sent photographs of this manuscript. He believed it was very early. He had just gotten his PhD. He said, I think this is an extraordinarily early manuscript, but I'm going to send it to the 3 leading papyrologists, or papyrus scholars, which was an evolving discipline at the time. And each one of them wrote back to him independently of the others and said, this manuscript should not be dated any later than AD 150. And it's probably closer to AD 100. A fourth demurred, a German scholar. He said, no, I think it might be in the 90s. Most scholars today would regard John's Gospel as having been written in the 90s. And so here's a manuscript that may have been a direct copy of the original. We don't know. But at most, it's just a few decades after the original. It may be even within 1 decade, within single-digit number of years after the original. It's remarkable. Is it alone? No. We have as many as a dozen New Testament manuscripts from the 2nd century, and the numbers start increasing over and over, much more than that, so that by the time we get to the 4th century, we have well over 100. How many do we have of other classical literature by the time we get to the 4th century? 0. How about by the 5th century? Now we're dealing with about 165 manuscripts for the New Testament. How about classical literature? 0. The numbers just keep rolling, going on further and further. Within the first millennium, we have nearly 700 manuscripts of the New Testament, and for about half of classical authors, they have nothing. So if you're going to be skeptical about the New Testament, apply that skepticism to all that we know about the ancient Greco-Roman world. This reminds me of the saying, an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. This 1 ounce of evidence, this little manuscript P52, sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. And so it was basically an ounce of evidence is worth 2 tons of German scholarship. Evidence is what Christians know that they have if they know anything about our faith. And it's philosophical constructs that are often used against it without the evidence. Within 150 years of the New Testament's completion, over 40% of all the verses are found. That is, we have manuscripts today that were written within 150 years of the completion of the New Testament, and that cover more than 40% of the verses. And in the last 150 years, when all of the papyri have been discovered, these are our earliest manuscripts for the New Testament, these are the manuscripts that were not necessarily professionally done by after the age of the church councils. Most of them are 4th century or earlier, significantly earlier. Not a single new variant, not a single new wording or reading in more than 150 years has commended itself to scholars. That means that as important as these papyri are, and they are extraordinarily important, the 20th century is the century of papyrus discoveries. Not a single new reading has come out of these papyri. What the papyri do is they confirm the readings that scholars already knew about from the other manuscripts. That means that we have the original text in the manuscripts somewhere. We're not always sure if it's what's printed in the text or printed in the footnotes of our critical Greek New Testaments, but we can be pretty darn sure it's on that page somewhere. And that's what's significant, and it's something you cannot say about textual criticism for classical texts. They always have to resort to what's called conjectural emendation. That is, coming up with conjectures as to what was written here because we have 0 manuscript evidence for it. Sometimes the conjectures get so big they can't even begin it. Like when you have Livy's 135 volumes on Roman history, and we only have 40 of them. Well, you can't conjecture what 95 have said. It just, you can conjecture sometimes a few words here or there, but not that much material. But for the New Testament, most New Testament scholars, regardless of their theological stripe, do not think we ever have to resort to conjectures to determine the wording of the original New Testament. That's unlike anything else in the ancient world. So has the Bible been translated? I told you this is my first part of my lecture, 45 minutes. I'm right on the spot. Has the Bible been translated, retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? Or here's another way to look at it. 1611, the King James Bible was produced. The New Testament was based on 7 Greek manuscripts. The earliest of these was 6 centuries earlier than the King James, 11th century. Now, 403 years later, we have nearly 1,000 times as many manuscripts as they relied on. And we still have those 7, by the way. They weren't destroyed. And our earliest manuscripts go back nearly 1,000 times earlier. As time goes on, we're actually getting closer and closer to the original text, not farther and farther away. Okay, next question, and I'll deal with these last 3 fairly quickly. The quality or the nature of variants. What kinds of variants are there? 99% make virtually no difference at all. For example, the most common variant among the manuscripts is spelling variants. Somebody played a joke on me. Oh, here we go. That's better. But you knew what I meant, right? Even if I am from America. 70% of them are spelling variants. The most common textual variant we have among our manuscripts is called a movable nu. That's N at the end of the word when the next word starts with a vowel, like you say a book, an apple, or I think in Ogdensburg they say a book, a apple, don't they? But nevertheless, you know what they mean. The name for John in Greek is spelled Ioannes with 2 N's or Ioannes with 1 N. Every single time we see the name John in the New Testament, there are some manuscripts that have 2 N's, some that have 1 N. And then there's the Greek definite article, the word the. I wrote my master's thesis on when this word did not appear in the New Testament, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation on when it did appear. There's 20,000 of these little buggers in there. Those 2 works have been published, and I guarantee you they would cure the most hopeless insomniac. And yet, I'm still not sure exactly why it appears at times and why it doesn't. It appears with proper names. The Joseph and the Mary took the Jesus to Jerusalem. It's never translated that way. And we're not sure exactly of the significance, but we know it's not great because it doesn't affect anything. Then there's word order differences. In Greek, you can have words go in a number of different directions because it's a highly inflected language. So you can say, John loves Mary in Greek in any order. John loves Mary, John Mary loves, John, let's see, I guess Mary loves John. You can have it in that order, and still someone in Greek would say, this means John loves Mary because of the endings. They know what's the subject, what's the verb. You have the different spellings for the name John and Mary, the different, whether they have the article in front of them. And so I thought, about 1.5 years ago, how many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? Professors have a lot of time on their hands. And so I decided to spend a day typing up all the ways you can say John loves Mary in Greek. So take your notes out, your notepads out. This is going to show up in the quiz. There's 8 ways you can say John loves Mary in Greek. Every single time it's translated John loves Mary. Oh, wait, there's another 8 ways. Wait, there's more. There's 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. Every one of those is different. And yet every time it's translated John loves Mary. Now, with conjunctions that are often untranslated, you can also say it a number of ways. Are you taking notes? 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. That took me 8 hours to put together. Hope you appreciate it. But that's not all. There's word orders that swell the numbers to over 500. I just decided, man, that's just enough. I think I'm illustrating the point pretty well. You use a different verb for loves that mushrooms the numbers to nearly 1,200. Now, listen to what Bart Ehrman says and put that illustration in this context. We could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the text of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. He's absolutely right. We could go on nearly forever talking about these thousands and thousands and thousands of textual variants, like the 384 different ways to say John loves Mary. Every one of those is a textual variant. If we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without substantially changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless 400,000, I'm really surprised that's it, because the numbers could be an infinite number. I would have expected something like 10 million or so with the number of manuscripts we have. What counts is the nature of the variants. And so let me bring us to the smallest group of variants that are both meaningful and viable. That is, these are the variants that have a good chance of being authentic, and they can change the meaning to some degree. It's less than 1% of all of our textual variants fit this category. These are the only ones that textual critics ever debate. In fact, it's less than 1/4 of 1%. I'm going to give you real quickly two examples. Mark 9:29. Here, after Jesus' disciples had tried to cast out demons, there were particularly pesky demons, and they couldn't get exorcised. And so they came back to Jesus and said, couldn't do the job. And he says to them, this kind can only be cast out by prayer, or by prayer and fasting. Well, which one did he say? The earliest manuscripts just say prayer. Later manuscripts have fasting. Some of you who cast out demons on a regular basis, probably this is a good variant to study. And most scholars would say, you know, what Jesus said here is this kind can only be cast out by prayer, period. And as you can see just by looking at me, I agree with the shorter reading. But nevertheless, all right, let's get past the convicting stuff. Revelation 13:18. This is the only other variant. I'm not going to talk about 400,000 textual variants with you, but here we have, let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Everybody knows the Antichrist number is 666. You go on the streets of Ottawa, people, yeah, I know that. Well, not so fast. In 1844, a German scholar studying the Bibliothèque Nationale discovered a manuscript that said 616. And that manuscript happens to be one of our two most important New Testament manuscripts today for Revelation. It's from the 5th century, but it was a lone wolf. 1999 at Oxford University, they published 17 papyri, and one of them was of Revelation. It's spread out over 9 chapters, 26 little postage stamp sizes. And in that manuscript at Revelation 13:18, it has the number of the beast as 616. I've had the privilege of looking at both of those manuscripts in the flesh. And I'd say even today, most scholars who know about this, they'd say, you know, I think 666, that's the number of the beast. 616, that's the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down. But it could be the number of the beast. I don't know if 616 is the number of the beast. It may be that it is, it may be that it isn't. Here's a place I don't know what the Word of God says in the original, what the New Testament says in the original. But I can tell you this, I know of no Bible college, no theological seminary, no theological institute, no denomination, no church that puts in its doctrinal statement, we believe in the virgin birth of Christ, we believe in the deity of Christ, we believe in the resurrection of Christ, and we believe the number of the beast is 666. It may be meaningful, it may be important, but it's not that important. And this is how it rises. It doesn't get closer to the theological beliefs that are crucial. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Well, in Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, we had Sir Lee Teabing say, until that moment in history, he's talking about the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless. Al-Azami was making the same claim. The Orthodox Church changed the text to turn Jesus into deity. Well, that council, which was sort of presided by Constantine, he opened it and came to close the ceremonies. This is what Teabing is declaring, that the emperor himself is the one who changed the text to make Jesus become God. Remember how I told you an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption? Well, here's another ounce of evidence, and we're just about finished. P66, another papyrus, dated about AD 175. It has most of John's gospel in it. Here's the first leaf of it. This is about 150 years earlier than the Council of Nicaea met. And this is the front page, where it says the gospel according to John. Then it starts with John 1:1. Read along with me, if you would, just that first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's what every manuscript says in every language. There's no essential differences at John 1:1 in any manuscript in any language. It's remarkable. Now, unless Constantine was about 175 years old, I don't think he could have invented the deity of Christ. So every single manuscript of John's Gospel, no matter the date or language, says virtually the same thing in John 1:1. Jesus is unequivocally called God. And the same can be said for the major passages that affirm his deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, his bodily resurrection, and his second coming. In other words, no essential doctrines are jeopardized by any of these textual variants. I want to close by quoting from Bart Ehrman and agreeing with him. In the appendix to his book, Misquoting Jesus, he was asked, "Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts?" Notice they said these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy, like the deity of Christ. Here's what he said. "Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament." The 3 times I've debated him, I've put this up there at the end of the debate, and then the debate's over. But I do it at the end rather than at the beginning because people would really get mad for coming for a 5-minute debate. But Bart can't disagree with it. Let me close with a very unnatural segue, but are very appropriate for this place. A polar bear attacks a man in Canada, and bystanders do nothing. The media don't even report this incident. Now get in your mind what that looks like. You see this polar bear attacking a man. Everybody got a mental image? If you just ate snacks, cookies at the break, you might want to close your eyes. Okay, here's the reality. I told the truth, didn't I? There are 400,000 variants for the New Testament manuscripts. I told the truth. But when you hear 400,000 variants, think of this image. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. We have a few questions for you. First question is, where are the oldest fragments of the New Testament kept?
Well, they are kept, all of the New Testament manuscripts are kept in over 253 different sites throughout the world. There's no central depository, and nobody wants to give up theirs and give it to somebody else. The papyri, we have a lot of the papyri in England and in Italy, in France as well, some in Germany, some in America. And there's other places where they are. There's some papyri in Sydney, Australia that we photographed, and Scotland and other places. So they're all over the world.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just remind you, if you want to text in a question, it's 613-769-3576, or you can, you can tweet it. That's okay, hashtag Delve14. Another question for you. Let's see. My question is, why is the book of Enoch referenced in the New Testament in Jude 14:15, but it's not included in the canon?
That's a great question. I think it is definitely quoted there in the book. This is not wanting to do this right now. Well, see it? All right, that's going to work. I'm not exactly sure why. There's a number of reasons why Jude may be quoting from that book, but I think there's a sense that he's recognizing that this has some validity for what his purposes are. When he says, as the seventh from Adam, Enoch says this, and then he quotes an alleged prophecy, this has value for his audience. I think that the readers at that time would have valued this. It's called intertestamental literature. Whether they regarded it as authentic or not, that's much more difficult to tell. My guess is probably not, and that they are realizing this is not really by Enoch, but this is something that, like when Paul quotes from a Greek poet, and he says, as this author says, Cretans are lazy beasts and evil gluttons. And basically what Paul says is, as this man prophesied. Well, Paul did not believe that pagans could genuinely prophesy, but he's putting that together in such a way that is useful for his purposes to say, even this guy got it right, even though he's going to miss things. And so even this pseudepigraphical work, the Book of Enoch, got it right for the purposes we have.
Thank you. Another question is, could you comment on your perspective on the reliability of the Quran with respect to manuscript copies?
Yeah, but I need to wear a bulletproof vest from now on to do that. Actually, there's a fellow by the name of Keith Small who wrote his doctoral thesis at the London School of Theology, and it was a combined doctoral thesis on the textual reliability of the New Testament compared to that of the Quran. And he worked with two different departments, Islamic studies as well as New Testament studies, and that doctoral work has been published, and he's published a popular book based on it as well. And one of the things he discovered is that the copies of the Quran, for the most part, are very carefully done. And at the same time, we know that we cannot get back to the original Quran because of Caliph Uthman, a man who lived about 50 years after Muhammad. He gathered up all the copies of the Quran and destroyed them, except for the one that he wanted to declare as the official copy. So we can't get past Caliph Uthman's date. Most likely we can get back to his Quran, but we don't know what came behind that. What's interesting, though, is a lot of Muslim scholars will say there's not a single mistake in any Quran manuscripts. They all say exactly the same thing. That is not really true. There are mistakes in the Quran manuscripts, and I have seen them with my own eyes where they have erased on the parchment leaf certain words and then put a different word in there. So they made mistakes and they corrected it, but there are definitely mistakes there. And we have what's known as palimpsest. It's a manuscript that's been scraped over by some scribe centuries later, then written on top of. And we have a number of Quran manuscripts that are palimpsests. There is even the possibility, I'd say a likelihood, that there are some pre-Uthman palimpsest manuscripts that are palimpsests that were written later, but the undertext was prior to Uthman, so we can find out what the Quran looked like before his time. But it's very difficult to gain access to those because there's certain political agendas in place that keep us from looking at it.
Okay, thank you. Another question, can you comment on the shorter and longer endings of the book of the Gospel of Mark and the manuscripts that support the longer ending? Yeah,
the Gospel of Mark has a textual variant that's the longest textual variant we know of. It's 12 whole verses. Either they're added to the Gospel or they're omitted from the Gospel. Most New Testament scholars would say that the Gospel of Mark did not have those last 12 verses, verses 9 through 20. In those verses, that's where we read about the disciples picking up snakes and drinking poison and not getting hurt and this sort of thing. And a lot of people would like to say, well, the early Alexandrian scribes, these are the scribes who have given us what most would consider to be the best New Testament manuscripts, cut those verses out because of this kind of sensationalizing kind of a thing. The problem is that we have, if we look at what church fathers quote from those last 12 verses, they quote from the verses explicitly that speak about drinking poison and picking up snakes through the first 6 or 7 centuries about 10 times as often as they do from the first half of those 12 verses that are not sensational. In other words, they quote them and they approve them, so there was nothing in their minds that, oh, this is really a bizarre kind of thing, we don't want Christianity to look like this. So I think it's an error for us to think that these Alexandrian scribes or any scribes cut out those 12 verses. Instead, I think it's far better for us to realize that early scribes, I think by about AD 120, put those 12 verses into the Gospel of Mark because I think it originally ended at Mark 16:8. Now, I could spend a long time on this, but I'll keep this brief, but it's an important question. It's our longest textual variant. There's one other one in the New Testament that's 12 verses, and then the next longest one is 2 verses, so it just drops down immediately. But for this passage, I think Mark intended to end his gospel at verse 8, where it says that the angel spoke to the women who came to the tomb, told them to announce to Jesus that he would meet them there, and they did nothing, for they were afraid. And it ends, period, on a downer. All the way through Mark's gospel, you got Jesus telling people, don't tell people who I am. And what do? They go out and tell people who he is. At the end, you finally have an angel saying, announce to Jesus' disciples that he's raised from the dead. And what do? They don't do anything. So it's irony in the end. And it shows, I think, we have some open-ended literature in the ancient world. One person did his doctoral work on this to show that there's documents that end a book where it's open-ended, doesn't come to a conclusion. And that Mark's gospel probably follows in that rarer literary form, where basically he's got people reading this gospel along and saying, okay, if I'm going to believe in Jesus, it'll cost me something. And finally, he gets to the end of the gospel, and even though Jesus is raised from the dead, he does not appear to any disciples, but just to the angel who makes this announcement. And so you have, at the end of the gospel, no appearance by Jesus. That's what triggered a number of responses. Early on, people said, this gospel doesn't end with an appearance by Jesus. We got to put one in. And so we have 5 different endings to the Gospel of Mark. It's only the long ending that people know about, the long one and the short one that ends at verse 8. But there's other additions that were added that surely would never have been added if this long ending had already been there. They're much more vanilla. They're not very interesting. These 12 verses are much more interesting. There's a lot more to say on this, but I'll just have to leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, one last question for you, Dr. Wallace. Is it true you are studying a manuscript that may confirm Paul as the author of Hebrews?
No.
Okay.
That was an easy question. I don't know of any such manuscript.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, well, I'll give you one last one then.
Well, my wife believes that, but she doesn't know anything. About Greek. Sorry.
Okay, here's the question. Was there much variance in the languages over the times the manuscripts were found? I.e., did the usage of Greek change much in the several hundred years of ranges from the Greek manuscripts like English did from the King James Version till now?
It's a great question. Basically, what the question is asking is, has the Greek language changed, and have scribes changed the copies that they're making to conform to those changes? Here's one of the remarkable evidences that even our very late manuscripts are pretty darn accurate, is they reflect Greek usage that was not current in their day. It was obsolete. It was gone. It was only historical. And consequently, you get, beginning in the 4th century, what's called Byzantine Greek. That's the first era after the New Testament Greek. Then you get modern Greek starting in 1453, which we still have to this day. And the manuscripts still are written in Koine Greek. It's a Greek that demonstrably did not exist after that period. And that shows that these scribes are doing something that it's against their natural proclivities, against their nature. It's doing something that they may not even altogether understand, but they're copying faithfully. Thank you,
Fantastic.
folks.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace.